So before I start this video, I'd like to cover something. The video is primarily going to be designed to be more informational in this sense, in a way to aid your decision making of how to upgrade the hideout and what may be considered a valuable purchase. Obviously, if you're EOD, this very likely doesn't apply to you unless you're using an alt account. This is not going to cover if this is actually worth for you to spend real life money in upgrading your actual game account. I'm going to start off the video by going over the prices of each of the upgrades, both by tier and by the per slot cost that each of the tiers have, as far as like a cost analysis. Later in the video, I'll also be covering the value of each of the upgrades as it pertains to each individual. There'll be more of that to come eventually. As the flea market prices on individual items are subject to change to a very large margin of change, I will purposely be leaving the cost of each of the items needed to upgrade the various stash tiers, as well as any prerequisites out of the video, both for the simplicity of it and because of the extremely large margin for error based on the flea market prices being constantly changing and based off of the unknown quantity of how many items could be potentially found in raid. This could be extremely different for two separate people, so I'm just going to be leaving it out of the video. For the purpose of this video, I will strictly be focusing on the currency prices of each of the upgrades, and nothing more. Let me go ahead and detail the currency cost of each of the stash upgrade tiers, as well as solve for the per slot cost of each of the tiers, as this will serve as sort of a foundation for the rest of the video. Starting off at tier 1, we have the standard account stash size, which is 10 by 26, or 260 total slots. This is the lowest and consequently free stash size that anyone can possibly have. Now, upgrading from tier 1 to tier 2 being the Left Behind edition, is an upgrade from a 10 by 26 stash to a 10 by 36 stash, which is 360 total slots. This upgrade has a currency price of 3.5 million rubles, and since the upgrade is giving 10 more slots vertically, and that means we're gaining an extra 10 by 10 area, or 100 slots from the upgrade, this means that the tier 1 to tier 2 upgrade has a per slot cost of 35,000 rubles. Now, ascending from the tier 2 to tier 3 upgrade, again, barring any prerequisite costs or any items cost, as you can see the items are listed here and any of the heating or vents requirements you'll need, the stash is being upgraded from 10 by 36 to 10 by 46, which is now 460 slots. This is a much steeper price of 8.5 million rubles. This means that since we're gaining another 100 slots from this upgrade, the per slot cost, or PSC as you might see it posted on screen, the per slot cost of this is 85,000 rubles. This is a very steep increase from our first upgrade. Finally, we have the tier 3 to tier 4 upgrade, which is the EOD edition stash size, which is a notable increase, giving us a boost from 10 by 46 to 10 by 66, which is 660 slots. The price on this, however, is fairly ludicrous. It comes out to 150,000 euros. Now, trader prices are prone to change based on trader reputation, but as it currently stands, I can buy euros from Skier for about 120 rubles each, meaning that the cost conversion from euros to rubles equates to a whopping 18 million rubles for the final upgrade. However, considering that the slots gained is doubled from the tier 2 to tier 3 and tier 3 to tier 4, this means that we are gaining a stash size of 200 additional slots, which equates to approximately 90,000 rubles on a per slot cost to upgrade to the largest stash size from 3 to 4. This doesn't cover any of the prerequisites for traders, such as Peacekeeper to 4, Ragman to 4, Proper or Ragman to 3 to get the level 3 upgrade. It doesn't cover any of this. It only strictly covers the direct currency value of the prices for upgrading to each successive tier. Let's go ahead and expand on this information a bit. So a regular item case is currently roughly 1.5 million rubles. We'll just go ahead and say it is for simplicity's sake. This offers a storage space of 8 by 8, which is 64 slots. And if we take away the actual size of the item case itself, which is 4 by 4, as you can see right here, that means 16 slots. We are essentially gaining 48 slots to our stash every time we purchase a regular item case. This means that the Tier 1 to Tier 2 upgrade is right about the same price and value as purchasing 2 regular item cases. And because of this, I would wholly suggest that if you have the money for it, go ahead and upgrade your stash to the Tier 2, provided you're on a standard account. This one is the one that's kind of a no-brainer, and I pretty much would always suggest you to do if you have the option to. Moving up from here, we look at the per slot cost of the Tier 2 to Tier 3 upgrade, and see the price has gone up drastically, with a per slot cost of 85,000 rubles. At this point, upgrading past here quickly becomes a matter of personal opinion and playstyle. Hoarders will want to upgrade their stash all the way without question so they can store everything they get their little subhuman fingers on, while someone who plays like a min-maxing goon and breaks down and sells everything they find probably has no issue with stash size. From a purely monetary standpoint, it's about 3 times the price to upgrade your stash via the hideout from Tier 2 to Tier 3, as it would be to simply purchase a couple of regular items cases, as both would give nearly the same amount of relative stash size increase. Looking at the upgrade from Tier 3 to Tier 4, which is the EOD edition again, we see the extremely steep price of 150,000 euros, which is roughly 18 million rubles, and the barely higher per slot cost of 90,000 rubles, and we can deduce the same reasoning on this upgrade as well. At face value, this would seem to be a simple answer, but there are a couple of things that people don't think about too much when looking at raw data such as this. I spoke to a few people from Twitch chat, despite my better judgment, and in doing so I had a few more questions that I didn't initially realize. Like, one of the more almost philosophical based ones is, what is the real value of a stash? And in asking that, I asked myself, what is the inherent or perceived value of a stash? So the real value is, simply put, it's where you put your crap. You obviously put your items cases and weapons cases and all this stuff in here. So if you were on a standard account, you would have distinctly less space. But the inherent value of this is something entirely different. This also very greatly changes based on the type of player you are. And this is something that isn't necessarily discussed. It's kind of just subconsciously figured out. I'd like to take a moment and kind of discuss what this means. So the inherent value of a stash, or the perceived value of a stash, as it should be properly called, is basically the amount of usable space you have in your stash after you have removed all of the items or cases or whatever it may be that currently takes up space in your stash. So the value of an inherent stash size is basically whatever stash size you begin with. So if you're an EOD account, again, this doesn't matter. You have your stash size. There's no upgrading it. Doesn't really mean anything. But for standard accounts, you have a 10 by 26 until you upgrade it at least. So how much space you have and how much space you use is inherent based on the total amount, which would be 10 by 26, minus the amount that you generally keep for cases and any loose goods like stacks of money that aren't in a case, or any extra gear lying out of cases, or the cases themselves. So in this case, the top rows here, so item case, junk box, halanic, med case, money case, mag box, all of these here, and all of this here at the bottom. This would all be the reduction from the inherent value. So I'm not going to sit here and do the math because that requires a lot of effort and I'm lazy. I'm sure one of you nerdy types can sit down and calculate exactly how much that is. But this would take the same amount of space regardless of what size of a stash I have. So if I was on a standard account, I would still be using the same amount of reduced inherent stash size. So I'd still have the thick items case, the 2 thick weapons cases, and all of these cases up here, as well as my individual stacks of money for sorting purposes. All of this here would still all be the same, and all the stuff on the bottom would still be the same. So because that is a static value, now I'm going to guesstimate here and say that this is about 10 by 10 in size of the amount of total cases that this is adding up to. It's probably pretty close to that actually, so it's probably a pretty good guess. Let's assume that the total size that your cases that you would normally keep in your container, or your stash, excuse me, is 10 by 10. That means that 100 slots is being taken up no matter what your stash size is. Now, breaking this down, that means that the inherent stash size of a standard account would be 10 by 16 because you're reducing the size of all of these cases. So the inherent stash size of an EOD would be 10 by 56, I believe. But for the most part, this roughly 10 by 10 space that's being taken up from these cases here is always going to be the same relative value. So no matter what stash size I have, it's always going to be reduced as that static value, roughly 10 by 10. So if we take this and logically apply this, the relative stash size of each of these stash sizes is reduced by 10 on the right number. So the relative stash size of a standard edition would be 10 by 16, and then 10 by 26, and then 10 by 36, and then 10 by 56. So as you can see here, the standard edition is actually much smaller than it is initially perceived. This is why a lot of people end up upgrading from standard to a higher tier. I actually started on the Left Behind edition, so this little stunting, I guess you'd call it, is a lot less to me, and I'm also not a chronic hoarder. There are people that buy EOD for the simplicity of it and also to support the devs, in which case that's great. This, again, really doesn't apply to you. It's just however you decide to store your stash. But for everyone else that is either on standard or Left Behind or the one that nobody purchases, you have to ask yourself, what is the value of a stash? The true value of this is personal opinion. If you're a minimalist, even more so than I am, if you only keep one or two of a few things and you min-max your stash like a goon, then this really doesn't apply to you. You can probably run standard and it's generally not a problem for you, in which case this really doesn't affect you at all. For me, personally, I will explain why the fourth and final upgrade to a stash is not necessary. The simple answer to it is I simply don't use the space as is. I mean, I have all this stuff here, and I have all the stuff here, but there's all this empty space. If any of you have ever watched Pestily in his videos, he has a habit of just throwing all of his looted items into his stash and then selling it into pretty much one big bulk pile all at once. And if you play like this, then having a larger stash is very convenient because you can do that. But even then, having all of this empty space here means that there are still several runs that you can do successfully, make it out, store all of the things that you have on you that is not critical, such as anything besides mags and ammo and stuff like that. So all the loot that you would have gained, you can still store in your stash multiple raids over and over and over again. Let's say 4 full backpacks worth, and you still would probably only be down to about right here. So this probably is an ideal stash size. But again, this is purely personal opinion. Some people, or dare I say several people, may have several items cases or a large stash of regular weapons cases, or 5 different mag boxes, or several meds cases, or multiple scav junk boxes, in which case their inherent stash size is much less, in which case the value of a stash is much more. So let's delve into that a little bit further. If you have 100 million rubles, then the cost of upgrading your stash means pretty much nothing. If you run labs constantly and you're extremely good at it and you have a 70% survival rate, which is about 10 people, then this probably doesn't mean a lot to you because you're just overflowing with money and you can spend it as you frivolously please. But the average Tarkov player is actually not as good as everyone may think they are. They're actually pretty terrible, no offense. So a lot of people have issues with stash management and they have issues with getting money and a lot of other things. So is the price cost really worth it? Let me bring up a comparison here for you guys to understand what the true value of this really is. So on the market right now, and again, there's not that many listings at this current time, you can see that a thick items case is about 11.3 million rubles. Now, to be fair, this is probably the most expensive that I've seen it. And again, this is directly depending on the price of the flea market. And I wholly expect that if this video gets any amount of views, that this number is probably going to go up drastically. But let's say for the sake of this, that a thick items case is a container size of 196, if you're on mobile and can't see this. The size, the actual case size of a thick items case is 15. Reduce that from 196 to get the actual container increase or stash size increase, and that's 181. Let me show you the math here just to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. See, 181. That means that for every time that you buy a thick items case, you are essentially gaining 181 free slots in your container by purchasing this item. Now, you're doing so at the cost of either a lot of farming or what is currently 11.3 million rubles, but also consider this. You're gaining 200 slots for a cost of about 18 million rubles. Now, again, this isn't counting any of the prerequisites for any of this. All of this stuff to get generator level 3, to get workbench level 3, to get heating level 3, intelligence center 3. This is pretty much your entire hideout, almost entirely maxed. So you have to upgrade all of this, but barring that by its own, just the price of the euros is 18 million rubles, give or take. Now, that's 18 million rubles or 200 slots additional in your container. Or you can spend 11.3 million rubles and basically get almost the same thing. So if thick items cases still have an upward trend of price, this may not be valuable in a week or 2 weeks or a month or two, but as the current value states, it's not really worth. Why would I go and spend 18 million rubles on something that gives me no greater increase other than stash size when I could do it for almost the same increase in stash or distinctly less than the price? This is about 2/3 of the price. So if you nerdy types want to know the actual value of this, you are spending about 62.4 thousand rubles on every slot you are gaining with a thick items case. Again, this is prone to being changed, but as it currently stands, this is the approximate price of gaining additional spaces in your hideout by buying thick items cases. Now, if you remember back here on the level 3 version, or the Prepare for Escape edition, the per slot value of how much money you had to spend was 85,000 rubles per slot. Based on this number here, it's still cheaper to buy a thick items case at this same value than it is to take all of these items and all of this upgrading and purchase the stash size upgrade to level 3. If this is a strictly money-based decision, it still is more worth to put in the money into a thick items case. The level 1 to level 2 version is still worth no matter what. It's 35,000 rubles per slot for a increase in stash from level 1 to level 2. Pretty much everyone's going to do this that isn't absolutely dirt poor. The increase between level 2 and level 3, I personally did because I like having the free space to work with. It allows me a lot more room to build weapons and a lot of other things like that. And these are things that you can't necessarily account for in the true value of having a stash size increase. Things that most people don't think about. How much room do you want to have to work with to build your weapons? How much room do you want to have to move your items around or move backpacks or sort things? These are things that most people don't generally go over. This adds into the question of what is the true value of a stash? And again, it's personal opinion. For every single person that plays this game, few two people are going to play it exactly the same. So this is a question that you personally have to answer. But based on these statistics right here, because the current market value of a thick items case is about 62.4 thousand rubles per slot, that means that both level 2 to level 3 and level 3 to level 4 stash size increases via the hideout are simply not worth it. Because this is such a fickle nature and these sorts of things are very heavily dependent on playstyles and how well you organize and a very great number of factors, the variance between person to person is extremely high. So the true value of a stash may be entirely different to one person as it is another. But based on the purely monetary perspective, I'm pretty much done at 3. I can gain additional spaces by buying another thick items case and putting it down here at the bottom or, wherever the hell I decide to put it. And it'll do more for me based on a per slot value than upgrading my stash. I really don't use most of the space here, so why bother upgrading it even more? But I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. This video has been way longer than I intended it on being. I really do hope that this kind of gave you a new perspective on things and helped you make a more informed decision on what to do in terms of upgrading your stash. I tried to be as thorough as possible without taking, an entire hour of your time. So I hope this was informative for most, if not all of you. And if you have any questions about how I could have made this better or things I could have covered that I didn't, please let me know. I'm always trying to improve my content, and these sorts of things would help me much more than you probably realize. Thanks everyone for watching. Stay safe, and happy hunting in Tarkov.